we noticed that this new phenomenon of neoconservatism was taking over the US foreign policy. There had always been a problem of this, but it really became institutionalized in the 1990s with the formation of what later became the Bush cabinet. And we had, at an early point, as this was accelerating, the absorption of all of these former Warsaw Pact countries, we had noticed a policy document called the Project for a New American Century, which was a document put together as a manifesto to declare the Anglo-American world government that had to be created after the only forces that were not fully under the control of the Wall Street London banks, such as China, India, Russia, were dismantled and completely destroyed. At that point, when there were no other possible oppositions to Anglo-American hegemony, you could institute what's called the end of history. A society that would be completely governed in a state of total control and stasis, where you'd have an elite that would know their place, and you'd have the plebeians at the bottom who would be depopulated, dumbed down, useful little workers who were permitted to have a certain amount of pleasures, and those who were otherwise just slaves in the nether regions of South America and Africa and Asia. And this was at the heart of the neoconservative ideology. In fact, one of the key philosophers was Francis Fukuyama, who coined the term the end of history. And I'm going to actually quote from him in 2 slides. But this couldn't work, because this is based on a paradigm that human beings are otherwise just animals to be controlled by a master alpha class. That ideology, it's been there for a long time as well, and it's not true. Human beings exhibit, as Harley Schlein went to, a renaissance quality. When we have hope, when our creativity is allowed to be cultured, when our minds are allowed to develop, and we're given the means to actually be human, we can do things that no other species in the ecosystem can accomplish. And this is what any oligarchical system denies. And they will bring a nuclear war to protect their ideology. So, what's the alternative? Now, more recently, at the end of 2014, our organization published a 375-page report called "The New Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge," that essentially features in-depth expositions of every core project that is either already being created or that could be created very quickly internationally as drivers for a program of national reconstruction and development in an anti-imperial environment. And these are just some of the outlined projects. There's obviously many more secondary, tertiary projects that would unfold, but these are the core mega projects that are available to us. Many of the ones that are already advanced, you see in Eurasia. We're going to go through some of that today. So we want to see what is the New Silk, what is this New Silk Road that is the policy of China? What is this thing? What is the philosophy behind it? How is it impacting not just Asia, but other countries doing as part of that alliance? And then how will it follow up to impact Europe and North America if we choose to change the way our thinking and our policies are operating? So this is the most important phenomenon right now that's scaring the shit out of the oligarchy. You've all seen this coalition of leaders, right? These 5 countries?
Yes.
Okay. So the BRICS nations came as an outgrowth of a process which we're going to look at a little bit. But right now, the Russia, India, China, Brazil, South Africa alliance has not just involved these 5 countries, but is bringing in more and more countries in Asia, Africa, and beyond into a sphere of influence, which is providing a very important quality of protection for these countries to engage in processes and developments that are in opposition to the IMF and World Bank desires. And they're creating an impetus of principle based on a positive conception of what economics should be vectored around. It doesn't mean that these countries are perfect. It doesn't mean that Roosevelt's program was perfect. It means that these countries are moving under a conception which is in alignment with the general interest of humanity. This will take on different forms, but the principle is the principle, and that's the key that we have to look at, because you judge by their actions, not by the words. But we are still going to look at some of the words put forth by some of these key leaders. But I brought up Francis Fukuyama before about one of the core ideological fathers of the neoconservative I'd almost call it a religion. He actually put together a short report, not as a fan of the BRICS or the New Silk Road or China, not as a fan, but it was a competent, in a sense, realization by the oligarchy, of which he is, you know, an appendage, of the nature of what this thing actually represents in history. And I'm just going to read a little short segment. And again, he is not a fan of this process, though it might sound like he is. He's just taking a very clear, objective evaluation of what this process is that's arisen in the last few years, where he writes, as 2016 begins, an historic contest is underway over competing development models, that is, strategies to promote economic growth, between China on the one hand and the USA and other Western countries on the other. Although this contest has been largely hidden from public view, the outcome will determine the fate of much of Eurasia for decades to come. Indeed, One Belt, One Road represents a striking departure in Chinese policy. For the first time, China is seeking to export its development model to other countries. Chinese companies, of course, have been hugely active throughout Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa in the past decade, investing in commodities and extractive industries and the infrastructure needed to move them to China. But One Belt and One Road is different. Its purpose is to develop industrial capacity and consumer demand in countries outside China. Rather than extracting raw materials, China is seeking to shift its heavy industry to less developed countries, making them richer and encouraging demand for Chinese products. Now, of course, he's still looking at China as a competitive interest that ultimately should be crushed in any way, shape, form, or size possible. However, it's true. This is generally what has actually happened. There is a historic contest underway between a new program, a new development model. And this didn't come out of nowhere. There's a lot of points of departure I could take up, and we've written a lot of material about our own organization's 40-year-plus record in shaping this new just world economic architecture, which is expressing itself as we see it with the BRICS. But just to be brief, there is this was an image you'll find in a 1996 report that we published based upon a series of conferences and presentations that LaRouche's wife and the founder of the Schiller Institute, Helga Sepp-LaRouche, gave to China in 1996. This is her at the eastern terminal of the Eurasian land bridge. In China, she's known as the New Silk Road Lady. It's been recognized by the Chinese establishment themselves that the very term New Silk Road, as an homage to the old ancient Silk Road of 2,000 years ago between China, the Arabic nations, and Europe, that was a way to not just to trade goods, but also inventions and cultural treasures. That idea that we were bringing forth into the 21st century, she was the first to coin that. And in 1993, we had, as an outgrowth of a program that our organization had created for the reconstruction of Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we had a whole program that we had been fighting for and that had made a lot of headway around what's called the industrial triangle of Vienna, Paris, and Berlin, to use this core industrial capacity to develop the regions like Poland as modern, advanced societies under a new Marshall Plan, like we did after World War II. We had a program to make this happen, which was ultimately sabotaged. Many people were assassinated in this period. As one of the leading collaborators of our organization at that time was a leading banker who was the head of Deutsche Bank, who was actually killed when he was moving in this direction. And the euro was then created as a way for the bankers in London and Wall Street to recapture control of the countries of Europe that they were otherwise on the brim of losing. So as an outgrowth of this policy that we began in 1989, we ended up formulating a larger program with a lot of our collaborators in Asia and Russia that would involve taking the New Silk Road as an engine for growth and unite an industrial or a reindustrializing Europe with a modernizing Asian world and uplift everybody in between. And this is a 1993 EIR, that's our weekly publication that we published with a lot of reports. You can get this online. And we gave hundreds and hundreds of conferences on this subject throughout Europe, North America, Asia, which got the attention of a lot of leading establishment figures in China. Because it's a bit of an anomaly. When you have an American group that's working with European groups calling for a comprehensive policy for the revitalization of China with really thought-through designs, that stands out. That very much stands out. And Helga was invited at a certain point to give some core presentations at leading conferences sponsored by the government, which manifested in that program there. This is a 1996 document featuring high-speed rail corridors, new development corridors, new cities stretched out all over the Eurasian zone into Europe and through the Middle East. Obviously, there's zones that would connect into North America and into Africa, which we'll look at in a little bit more detail. So, 1997 rolls up. You have the formation of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization of Russia, China, India as an observer country. Many other countries are a part of this. And you actually have a survivors bloc, right? All of these nations that were being dismantled, unified, they created this organization. And immediately you saw a motion to get this thing underway. And it was really just because you had the Asian crisis, sponsored again by people like George Soros, the mega speculator who was able to bring Asian economies like Indonesia to their knees, that the capital was no longer provided for these projects to unfold. And it was sabotaged. And for a long time, a lot of people thought it was dead. Until very recently. I'm going to show a little 2-minute video sponsored by the Chinese government, which I think gets the point across well enough of what has arisen since 2013.
A mutually beneficial road of interconnection has spread before us. The Silk Road Economic Belt and 21st century maritime Silk Road begins with overland railways and sea lanes in China, connecting trade routes throughout Asia, Africa, and Europe, and will directly affect billions of people across the world. It's planned as one of the largest and most comprehensive development projects in human history. As it progresses, it will improve infrastructure all along the route. A network of highways, railways, ports, as well as facilities for energy, healthcare, and education. It aims to provide assistance in areas where it is desperately needed, allowing isolated regions to develop together and to facilitate investment, trade, and cultural exchange. Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the Silk Road Fund are already providing financing, and opportunities remain for investors from the private sector. The Belt and Road Initiative is all about opportunities to grow, to build, and to prosper together. The road that links us all.
So what we have again is an outline of what has been the new commitment by the Chinese government, which is not acting solo. This is not a unified, unipolar idea going out to try to recolonize the world through new British Empire techniques, as a lot of the slanders against this program have tried to paint it. And if you try to look online, and you look at almost any Western analysis of what this thing is, it's really they're trying to paint it as the new British East India Company, trying to conquer the world by economic rather than military arrangements. But unlike the British Empire and the British East India Company, they're actually exporting something that they've done themselves. The British Empire, if anybody's had an honest look at what they did to Africa, India, Ireland, here, it's always get your victims to swallow the free market poison. Don't drink it yourself. So the British Empire never actually took on free trade themselves. They always had the knowledge to keep protectionism so that they would have the monopoly on industries. They always did that. And also, China actually is taking something which has worked to develop and elevate over 500 million people out of poverty in the past 10 years. That's the only reason why the United Nations has met its Millennium Development Goals. It's not because of anything that Europe or North America has done. It's entirely because China has managed to move all of these people, hundreds of millions, out of poverty at an accelerating rate. But they've taken this program, and that's what they're exporting, and they're actually allowing the countries that work with them to develop, which the British Empire never did. Never. So this is the two aspects of in September of 2013, you had, in Kazakhstan, Xi Jinping announced the new Silk Road development belt as being, otherwise known as the One Belt, One Road program, as being the foreign policy, which loosely stretches through here, but there's so many secondary and tertiary programs, it gets complex. But you need a solid unifying vision, and without a vision, as the saying goes, the people perish. So you have a unified concept that's organizing all of the problem solving that comes up as you're going along the process. And a month later, what was announced was the Maritime Silk Road, the building up of new systems of ports, of canals that would unite all the way up through the Indian Ocean into the new canals that were forming around Egypt, which is part of this process, that having built the second Suez Canal, recently completed a few months ago, into Greece. And Greece being a major port being invested in by China. The only productive investments in Europe are happening from China. Right? If you actually look at Greece, the only place that they're allowed to get to use any capital for production is coming from Chinese investment. The Troika won't let any of the bailout money that they have given to the Greeks go to the Greek people or to the development of the Greek nation. It's all going back to the private bankers who speculated with the nation's debt and with the people's debts. It's only going back to the gamblers. Nothing is going back to the actual well-being of the people. So what we have here is an actual program where Greece is, the port of Piraeus is a core place where the actual overground rail, high-speed rail belt connects with the Maritime Silk Road. And this would be the core of the renaissance of the economic renaissance of Europe, would be Greece, the place that's currently the most destroyed. There's a lot of other ports from Africa, Kenya, Indonesia, Thailand, that we won't necessarily go through, but that are all developed in full detail in our Landbridge report, which I encourage everyone here to purchase copies of and get more copies out so that people get a sense of what the hell is going on. But that's all at the table outside. Now, this process, as I mentioned, you had a meeting with the, up here what we see is the September 2013 meeting that created the Eurasian Economic Union. Not the European Union, the Eurasian Economic Union of Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. Those are the three presidents. There's been a few more members joining up until the present day, which is a bloc which, as the president of Kazakhstan, President Nazarbayev, has said, he mentioned at the ceremony that unveiled this new grouping that this is a new geopolitical reality of the 21st century that has been born. A fundamentally new model of good neighborly relations and interactions between peoples in the general great Eurasian space. So this is a guy who's been fighting for quite a number of years for a new Bretton Woods alternative economic system based on the fact that the Western model is built, there's a collapse function built into it. So you have people who have been working very hard at preparing the field such that an alternative system can arise that would not be one dominated by a fascist dictatorship. So you have the Eurasian Economic Zone set up, which Ukraine was very close to becoming a member. That's something that we're also not told very much. That right before you had the overthrow of an otherwise pretty corrupt government, gotta admit, but right before that 2014 overthrow of that government and the installation of the new Western-backed, Western-controlled puppet government of Poroshenko, you had a major discussion for Ukraine to not only not join NATO and not join the European collapsing zone, but to join to become the fourth founding member of the Eurasian Economic Union. Now, this was complemented months later by the arrangement made to integrate that union with the new Silk Road Belt. So that's in May 2014, you had the joint declaration to unify these two organizations as one union. And then within literally 1.5 months after that, you had the what's called the Brazil BRICS Summit in Fortaleza, Brazil, that created the basis for the financing mechanisms, the announcement of a series of new altered, not IMF, not World Bank financing mechanisms to provide credit for the development of countries everywhere. But a whole statement of intention of how this would operate based upon the sovereignty of nations, not one world government. Vladimir Putin himself, at that very summit, made the point in describing how all of these projects would be financed. He said it very clearly. He said, "We are united by a desire to act from unified positions in all issues of global development and the formation of the global financial and economic architecture. We have been able to achieve significant success. I want to stress that all the plans we set for ourselves a year ago have come to fruition. I am referring first and foremost to our plans to create a new development bank and a currency reserve pool for BRICS nations. It's basically a way to fight off speculative attacks so that countries can't be caught the way the Asian 1997 economies were caught under Soros' speculative attacks on their currency. This new pool exists now to give a buffer and protection to all countries to survive and to actually fight back against people like George Soros and other Wall Street hedge funds. The BRICS Bank, today we have confirmed their founding documents. The BRICS Bank will become one of the largest multilateral financial development institutions in the world. Its stated capital will be $100 billion. The scale of possible operations within the framework of the currency reserve pool may also reach $100 billion. This mechanism creates the prerequisites for effectively creating our countries from, protecting our countries from financial market crises. The bank and the currency pool, with combined resources of $200 billion, lay the foundation for coordinating a macroeconomic policy between our nations. So this is not just those, not just the BRICS Development Bank and not just the reserve pool. It includes also the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank that as of January 1st of this year is now fully online and emitting credit for the development of countries. You have the new Silk Road and new Maritime Silk Road investment funds of $40 billion each, which again exist as investment pools for countries to develop their local infrastructure around this global paradigm. But you had also the announcement made recently of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Bank, another international bank that exists without conditionalities and for the purpose of providing actual development. So these are now, as of this, you had the UNISOR, the Union of South American Nations, and the CELAC countries, the Caribbean, Latin American countries, that immediately signed hundreds of billions of dollars of trade deals with China and Russia to be financed largely by these new banks. So if you look at China itself, what is it actually doing? We spoke quite highly of it, but we didn't actually say what's going on. So I'm not going to focus on everything. I'm just going to take a couple of elements here. Can I get a quick call for time? What time is it now? 3:22. Okay. All right, so what we have right now is a quick image of the high-speed rail built up over only 20 years in China. 25 years ago, there was no high-speed rail. Now they have 19,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. Right? Within 3 years, you're going to have 30,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. This is rail that goes beyond 200 kilometers an hour. Some of this goes as fast as 500 kilometers an hour. Some of it can actually go as fast as 600 kilometers an hour, but you don't really want to do that.
Is that in the tube?
No, the vacuum tube is something that they're also experimenting with that involves magnetic levitation inside of a vacuum tube, no friction, and that would go plus 1,000 kilometers an hour. China is the only country to have a commercial maglev rail system, produced by German innovation, but not applied by Germany because they were told by Schäuble and other financiers of the Troika that they have to shut down their nuclear power, shut down their industries, and basically go green, meaning no maglev.
Grow potatoes and drink beer.
Yeah, feudals, basically. The happy little feudal serfs.
Yeah.
The Troika is the IMF, the European Central Bank, and the European Commission. So this is just the concentric circles define the relative times it takes you now to get to these various places, like the furthest being Urumqi from Shanghai would be 12 hours. That's an enormous distance. Quickly, China's right now the longest high-speed rail system is from Beijing to Guangzhou, below it, at 2,298 kilometers. Longest line ever. They're going to go a lot bigger, but that's right now the world's largest. The fastest train is a 605 kilometer per hour train called the CIT 500. 60% of the global high-speed rail is financed by China internationally. And it's not just rail. Like, what you've got in China in the last few years has been the greatest investment in time of capital into mega infrastructure such as water diversion. 44.8 billion cubic meters per year is now being moved from the Yangtze to the Yellow River in the north, where there's a lot of drought in the north, a lot of death over the centuries in China based on the fact that there's no water in the north, overabundance in the south where there's destructive flooding. They've actually got a program that they've built in record time to move big chunks of this into regions to create flood controls in the south and to create a necessary amount of irrigation along the way and bringing necessary water into the north. Now this is a multi-phase project, but we're now beginning to see a blossoming of greening of deserts. You can peaceably have the Gobi Desert green within a very short period of time. It's a beautiful thing. What we have is 330 dams. It's not just China, but 330 dams internationally are being built by China, by the Chinese Export Bank and other companies in China, in 72 countries. So this is not, when you look at maglev, or when you look at high-speed rail, this is not maglev, this is high-speed rail. This is not what we're used to looking at when we look outside of a Montreal window and we see one of these clunky things driving down really noisily, transporting really not much. It's maybe shale gas and oil.
But the other ones are carrying people.
These are carrying people, and they also carry freight, both. And that is an example of Chinese technology not in action right now. That's infinitely more impressive. It's really beautiful. And if you look at right now the difference between the USA's high-speed rail network and China, it's dramatic. And this is, again, like 20 years, literally only 20 years, and most of it's in the past 10 years. But it's accelerating at an accelerating rate. Whereas America, there's a lot that's been discussed, a lot that's been sabotaged, and the amount that actually exists, which is a little over 800 kilometers, doesn't even go all that fast. It really pushes the limit of what is defined as high-speed rail. Canada is not even on that map because we don't have any high-speed rail. We had a lot of discussions from like a Montreal to Windsor rail, and that had a little bit of a hullabaloo, but nothing ever manifested. That's got to be corrected. And I mean, a lot of this stuff comes from the fact that we're addicted to using just highways and trucks to transport everything, which is an inefficient, nasty way of moving goods in the 21st century, when you consider that only 50 years ago we had more rail than we have today. This was actually taken down in the United States and Canada in order to have a basic, like a highway system. And also, when you talk about rail, you're not talking about just building rail all over the place. That's not what you're talking about. There's a quote I had by Helga that goes through the development corridor idea very well, but there's a whole section in here on how the principle of the development corridor works. You don't have just rail over land and that's it. You have the idea of 100 kilometers in either direction, as a width outside of the rail corridors, that are going to create new advanced cities, not giant monolithic, Hong Kongs of 15 million people. You want to have productive zones where you have high efficient communications, fiber optic cables. You want to have, you obviously want to have a lot of agricultural zones that are very well planned, that are not for cash cropping, but are actually for feeding, medium and small industrial farmers. And you want to have an integrated approach to city building. So you don't just have this idea of a suburban sprawl that just goes on like Chamonix or Toronto, just adding more and more like a plague. You want to have cities that have a purpose, right? that are organized with a bit of a thought ahead. And this is what we're seeing forming in places like India, where Narendra Modi, who's a very, very enthusiastic participant, to say the least, of the BRICS process, has called for 100 smart cities to be developed to take the youth that are being thrown into the gutter because they've been living under a colonial policy and use the minds of these youth as the drivers of real wealth creation under a national vision, which I'm going to touch on. This is actually Modi's program that he's endorsed, and well, circles around him have endorsed and advanced, called the Diamond Quadrilateral, based on thousands of kilometers of high-speed rail connecting the core Kolkata, Chennai, Mumbai, Delhi, which would integrate into the new Silk Road. In the case of the Eurasian Economic Union, as we brought up before, it's not just a union based on a monetary union. It's not like the euro. It's based on mutual development, again. And the actual name that was given to the program in Russia was the Trans-Eurasian Belt Development Project. And the Trans-Eurasian Belt Development, as I quote here from Vladimir Yakunin, who was the former president of the Russian Railways and a close friend of Lyndon LaRouche and our organization, he actually said the Trans-Eurasian Belt Development must be an interstate, inter-civilization project. It should be an alternative to the current neoliberal model, which has caused a systemic crisis. The project should be turned into a world future zone, and it must be based on leading, not catching technologies. That was in March 23rd, 2015. And what you see there is the Moscow to Beijing rail that's already begun construction. You see Yiwu there, but there's actually, that's going to become the world's largest rail when it's completed, when it goes all the way to Madrid. The actual stats on this thing, it's a $242 billion project. It takes a 5-day travel plan. It takes normally to go that distance over that terrain would take currently 5 days. When it's built, it'll move down to 30 hours. It'll become the world's biggest, at 13,000 plus kilometers, the world's biggest rail system. Currently, it's the Trans-Siberian Rail, which is 10,000 kilometers, but it's not high speed at all. That's the current world's largest. So that has to be modernized. That has to be upgraded. Now this is a beautiful one of Africa. The Prime Minister Li Keqiang of China had been on several occasions to Africa. He gave several presentations at the Africa in Ethiopia. In Addis Ababa, you've got the African Union complex, and he made the point that we should strive towards seeing high-speed rail connecting every African capital within the near-term future. China is the biggest investor in Africa, but unlike, as I said, unlike the British Empire, unlike any empire, they're actually doing honest business with Africa. They're actually allowing Africa to have cutting-edge technologies. They're actually creating engineering cores in Africa. Maybe not at the speed that some would like, but the fact that that's what's in motion is completely revolutionary. You already have 2,200 kilometers of Chinese rail built in Africa, 3,030 active projects. Some of the core ones that are happening right now are the $13.8 billion Nairobi to Mombasa rail line that connects the port of Nairobi, that's part of the Maritime Silk Road, with an overland rail grid that connects 5 countries like Uganda, Burundi, Kenya, the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and South Sudan. You've got many other programs that I'm not going to go into right now for Africa, some of which include a high-speed rail network in Nigeria, a very ambitious 13,000 kilometer high-speed rail network. That's a follow-up to the recently completed Nigerian rail system. That's 189 kilometers of Chinese-built rail in Nigeria, which is completely, again, allowing Nigeria to have a degree of economic independence so that it can make decisions outside of the influence and threats of the Western bankers. Very important. Now, stretching the New Silk Road now to South America, what we've got are bold proposals that feasibility studies are already done. Chinese firms are already working on putting this into full motion to create the first intercontinental rail, high-speed rail program of South America to connect ocean to ocean from Brazil to Peru. There's a few alternative lines. Some say it will go through Bolivia, others Paraguay, who knows. But the point is that that's right now the motion that we're currently feeling. And the second image you see up here is the Nicaraguan Canal, which is, again, being built as we speak, which is going to employ about 200,000 Nicaraguans and provide an alternative trade route for massive shipping. The biggest ships in the world that are too big for the Panama Canal can now go from Brazil through Nicaragua to China and other parts of Eurasia and Africa and India. Now, the Panama Canal, this has the additional benefit that the Panama Canal is controlled largely by U.S. interests. And so no longer do you have to deal with threats and monopolies of very, very dangerous zones like in Panama. Obviously, part of this, as you see in our other rail image here that we published in our report, involves a long overdue, over 100-year overdue project to connect all of the rail systems of South America into North America through Central America. McKinley died, the President McKinley died in 1902 when he was giving a presentation at a summit. He was assassinated by a British orchestrated plot of anarchists when his speech was based on doing just that, on using the U.S. program of Abraham Lincoln to help South America and Central America develop rail, the way Lincoln did for the transcontinental rail. Now this is something people probably have not seen. So this is what's going on internationally. Now, if you were paying close attention for a very short flash in the pan period of time, last year, actually May 2014, you had Le Devoir and several other papers around Canada that printed something called Peking to Montreal in Train. And then it disappeared. But this anomaly was really much more important than people realized. And this was the open announcement by leading Chinese institutions to invest in the Bering Strait rail tunnel. So this is not just a pipe dream idea. You already have the Trans-Eurasian economic belt building up all the way into Siberia. They're already doing it. They're building the China to Moscow rail connection to Europe that would connect also as part of this thing. They have offered to build, the Chinese offered tens of billions of dollars. I can't give you the figure, I forget. Russia also offered in an earlier time, under Putin in 2007, $60 billion to invest in building a tunnel about 200 kilometers long under the 60-kilometer Bering Strait passage. Is it 60 kilometers, Bob? Or is it longer? 90 kilometers. 90 kilometers Bering Strait passage. And that would open up the door to transforming the Arctic from what it is now as a zone of military confrontation, potentially, where you have, it's not just in the south, as we saw in the beginning graph of the encirclement of Russia, it's not just the south of Russia that's being encircled by NATO. Alaska, Norway, Denmark, potentially, there's a lot of pressure on Canada to adopt an anti-Russian military program in the Arctic. That's why Russia is militarizing its Arctic. It's not that they're trying to take over the North Pole. It's that they're responding to an actual threat, which they don't want. And that's why they made the offer to convert this zone into a mutual interest zone of mutual cooperation. And the amount of potential up there is really astounding.
So what happened?
It was ignored. The policy, the oligarchy, the way they operate is if you can't refute something or logically try to turn something down, you pretend it doesn't exist. And so, Putin came, he met with Harper back in 2007, and it wasn't permitted on the table. Every time he tried to bring it up, people just like ignored it, like looking at the wall. Then Bush and Obama did the same thing. And then what they would do is then turn it around and just bring up human rights abuses or something to change the discussion completely into something absurd.
Do you create a green environmental protection zone?
Huh?
Protection zone for the animals?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, if you actually look at, I skipped over the Middle East by accident, but I'm running out of time, so I gotta go fast. What you have here is a fold-out page inside of our report. I'm not going to find this right there. Of several aspects of the North American development program that we could unleash if we pass Glass-Steagall. If the United States Congress, if the population is able to rally themselves coherently in such a way that Glass-Steagall, that Martin O'Malley advances on this program to shut down the whole Wall Street bubble before it blows up in everybody's face and brings in fascism. If glass can be brought in immediately, you have available to the population of North America, Mexico, and beyond the ability to revive our lost industries. Canada has lost over 1 million productive manufacturing jobs in the past 20 years. Probably a lot more, just because of NAFTA alone. We've lost a whole engineering cadre. The people who actually had the skills to build our heavy infrastructure are in their 80s, 90s, or dead. So this is what we have to revive in the next generation who are currently being trained to really just be like advertising executives or marketing, whatever. Like there's not really a lot of productive employment for young people. You're lucky you can become a lawyer or something and make your mom happy. But it's really not, when you look at the crisis that we're in, that's not what's needed. So going back to some of the elements of what the ideas like what we see here with the Bering Strait, the need to connect the missing 1,000 kilometers of unbuilt rail, which would help to revive immediately the Alberta economy, which is entirely decimated, and build new cities, advanced cities along the way. This would also open up the door to a completely new way of thinking about Arctic development, which is much more advanced than Russia, where they're already building advanced modern cities with recreational zones in the Arctic, in places as far up as Umka, which has not actually been built yet, but everything is in motion to get this thing done soon. Of a domed city in Russia, powered by a nuclear reactor, evaporated waste disposal. It has obvious applications for mining, new types of science technology. They're using the ISS space station as a model, because obviously in the Arctic, you're not going to be able to just go outside and like pick your carrots. You have to have a complete internally controlled climate system with an internal biosphere. So you have to really make discoveries in the nature of ecosystems and biospheres if you're going to sustain life in a comfortable way in those regions. For 5,000 people and their families, that's a big ambition. But that's the type of thing that you think of when you go into these inhospitable zones, whether it's the desert, or whether it's the tundra, the Arctic desert, or whether it's space. You always have to think about what do you need to discover about the laws of nature to allow for your society to accomplish a mission. What type of creative discoveries have to be unleashed for something impossible to be made possible? Right? It's not in the money. It doesn't matter how much money you throw at something. If you've got a bunch of service economy, misanthropes, you're not going to get something done. So this is where the question of culture comes very important. And when you look at what trajectory we were on in the period of people like John Diefenbaker, our prime minister who was ousted at a certain point in the early 60s, there was a program for a northern vision for creating the new frontier of development. This is a 1958 design in Nunavut, in a place called Frobisher Bay, which is essentially way ahead of the curve. It was way ahead of its time. And millions of dollars were allocated towards building up feasibility studies on constructing this advanced city with a dome. Right? All the apartments are outside, the mall, recreation centers, everything else you want is underneath this structure. As a new model for international cooperation. That was sabotaged.
Right.
That was sabotaged by the Bank of Canada, that's run by the City of London. There was a big credit crunch, so basically all of the funds that Diefenbaker was trying to allocate to it, he couldn't get them because the governor, who was a British operative, was told to just contract the money supply because there was a certain recession happening at that time. And so rather than doing what you should do in a time of recession, which is do a Roosevelt, you want to invest in creating new potential, new jobs and production, they did the opposite. They did what Hoover did during the Great Depression, which is what sustained the Great Depression in the 1920s. Just austerity, contract the money supply. So you basically, you're sick, so you bleed yourself. And then if you're getting sicker, you're getting more dizzy, you bleed yourself more. It's very self-defeating. So Diefenbaker didn't think that way. He had a more Rooseveltian approach to it, but he didn't fully understand the environment of what he was operating in, which set him back quite a bit. Nonetheless, when you look for the application of the ISS space station for developing science cities in the Arctic, obviously, it's no surprise that China is also becoming the world leader in space technology. They're setting up their first space station. They've got literally more ambitious programs for not just doing what like Obama's saying, we have to like lasso an asteroid and like investigate the asteroid with no higher idea of what is man in space. There's no higher idea of the program for the future. It's just a waste of energy, pretty much. Whereas Russia, China especially, actually has a program. That's the Jade Rabbit rover, which was the first successful rover with a full laboratory deployed to the moon as part of a multi-phase Chang'e operation. This Chang'e, I think we're at 5 now, to actually start developing our capabilities to industrialize the moon. Where, obviously, if anybody looking at the fact that the moon is ripe with not only rare earths, but also things like helium-3, there is tons. Literally, I think it's something like 50 tons or something of helium-3. 50 million. 5 million tons of helium-3 is on the moon. We have hardly any of this on the Earth because of our electromagnetic field. China knows this. The head of their space program has openly talked about this, which is the need to use this as the way to break out of fossil fuels and to create a fusion economy. Helium-3 is the most efficient use of fusion power. That's the best way to get a full reaction where you don't emit any neutrons and you can contain a positive charged plasma with intense electromagnetic fields and deploy those million-degree temperature plasmas to perform work, whether it's terraforming, whether it's stopping an asteroid, which, by the way, Russia has a policy to stop an asteroid. They've actually put that on the table for us, and we don't even... How many people knew that Russia had a policy to stop an asteroid? Okay, I got a handful, I count them with one hand. Doesn't that piss you off? Russia actually put on the table in 2012 a program for us to cooperate with them on, instead of building anti-Russian missile shields, they said we can use our technologies together that currently are serving destructive purposes in the military and look at jointly defending humankind and the biosphere from asteroids, which, by the way, Russia got hit by a few major meteorites right before they made that announcement in Chelyabinsk. So,
I didn't mention it when they had that announcement.
No, it was not. There was a blackout on our media. And that's still on the table. There's actually an advanced intention to have an asteroid defense shield called the Strategic Defense of Earth, which itself is a revival of Lyndon LaRouche's Strategic Defense Initiative that he had organized Reagan and a small network of people around Reagan in 1981 to adopt, and he made policy of the U.S. towards Russia at that point when Reagan came on TV and made that announcement to take our nuclear weapons and turn them into something useful for humanity, to take our knowledge of the atom and turn it into something constructive based on mutually assured survival instead of destruction. That program was sabotaged by operatives around Gorbachev and Andropov, so it never became policy. And it was forgotten, and now it's been revived.
So, in other words, everybody's talking bad about Putin, but time to hire power we have.
Absolutely, absolutely, and not him by himself. He's got a network of people that he's been organized by, he's organizing with, that are highly influenced by Mr. LaRouche. And if you look at just some of the core advisors of Vladimir Putin, from Sergei Glaziev to Yakunin, and you could go on to Rogozin, the guy who proposed the asteroid defense program. These are people who are directly affiliated. He's the deputy prime minister of Russia. I agree. I'm saying that everybody's got friends and everybody's got advisors, and he's got some very good ones. And these are good ones who have been affiliated directly with our organization, with LaRouche's organizing, when LaRouche became a member of the Russian Academy of Sciences in '94. And LaRouche has returned back to Russia on several occasions on the various highest of levels of invitation to give presentations to the Duma. Literally, the establishment of Russia and the establishment of China and also people around Modi are directly there as a consequence of 40 years of organizing by this organization, by Helge LaRouche in China, by LaRouche in Russia. And just to end here, there's a quote by LaRouche where he says, because this brings up the question of value. What is the value of going to the Arctic? What is the value of going to space to mine helium-3 from the moon? What is the value of doing these things? You might have to wait decades before you start getting monetary returns on these types of investments. Who would do that in our society? Hell, you're not supposed to invest in anything that won't produce a monetary return within 3 years. That's a business model law that they teach. Now, LaRouche said, we're on the cusp of a new paradigm shift. So we got to realize that real value, and this is always about value, that's what governs our motive and our concepts and our sense of self. It's always an idea of what do we value, right? This has cultural, artistic application, scientific application, and obviously economic application. We said real value comes from and is measured by the development of the productive powers of labor. That is, through the introduction of scientifically created new technologies, implementing productive processes which increase the energy flux density through the physical economy in such a fashion as to immensely increase the productive powers of labor. That new system, that is the system that has been created after a lower ordered system, for example, fusion power. If you have a fusion economy, there's going to be all sorts of processes associated with fusion and the use of the atom that won't have existed in the previous petrol, chemical-based society. He says that that new system will create a process whereby the increase in energy flux density will itself increase at an accelerating rate. Not to be too intimidated by some of the language like energy flux density, it's not an intimidating concept. It's a new concept for a lot of people, but it's not overly complex. It simply means that because of this faculty of the human mind, which distinguishes human beings from animals, because it's not our DNA that does it, it's only the quality of the ideas that we can develop and act upon that creates a condition whereby our society uses different types of fire. And to the degree that we're being creative and thinking ahead, we know that every type of resource is fixed and will run down. We know that. Even as you improve your technologies to extract a better form of coal, or a more diffuse, hard-to-reach form of coal, as you do that, it still doesn't change the fact that the coal is still going to be finite. And unless you make a qualitative shift to discover new physical principles and free yourself from the boundary conditions that were contained within the old system, your system will always turn into an empire and collapse. You'll always start cannibalizing young. It's like that for any animal. If you throw it within a room, you have a bunch of rabbits and a limited amount of food, those rabbits are only going to grow to the point that the food is still there, and then they're going to cannibalize the young. Any animal will do that, and humans will too, on the condition that we're not actually cultivating what's fundamentally true and good about us. And what you see there is the trajectory. From 1962, you actually had forecasts based upon the investments into fusion power, into the nuclear rocket of John F. Kennedy, into the general commitment towards getting out of fossil fuels and going towards a fission-based society. That program, if you just took the basic trends of where society had been going from 1780 to the present, you should have already had over double the quantity of energy available per capita to our society at this point, right? At a best or even worst case scenario. However, what we've seen is that the paradigm shift that was begun in 1968 to 72, where we detached the dollar from Bretton Woods and unleashed the post-industrial model of society, this is what became what we talked about at the beginning, right? Globalization, empire. At that moment of the deaths of people like Martin Luther King, Robert F. Kennedy, and others in Africa and in other parts of the world, you had the petrodollar created. The whole economy became centered around monetarism, speculation of floating exchange rates, controls of nations for diminishing returns of resources, and ultimately, the idea of overpopulation that people like David Suzuki are trying to feed to us is really just the fact that we have allowed ourselves to be dominated by empire. It's not the natural condition of man to be overpopulated. It's that we permitted ourselves to think that stupidity is normal and adapt to that. So, there's a lot that's been written on that. I'm just showing you quickly before we get into the next presentation on the question of culture. Because ultimately, why do we do these things? Is it really some utilitarian idea that we need to have more energy flux density because we need to consume more, because we need to produce more? Is it really that whole, that's why we want progress? Or is there something more beautiful that makes this direction a necessity, that has more to do with this idea of the Renaissance and this idea of art, culture, and creativity, that is really the soul of what makes human beings worth something? And that's what John Philippe will speak about after we do maybe a brief Q&A, because I think I spoke too long. So if you guys have anything to throw at me, huh? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Maybe expand on a little bit more about fusion energy.
Okay.
like the original, like before finding helium-3, all of the discoveries being made in like the 70s?
Sure. Well, everybody here has some familiarity, I would imagine, with fusion power, right? Yeah? Anybody not familiar with fusion power? Okay. You know what? You've heard of fission power, right? Fission, not fusion. Okay.
No.
So you got two things here. You got fission and you got fusion. Fission is something which we've been using since the 40s in a civilian way, where basically people at the turn of the 19th century, like Madame Curie, a grouping of other people, had discovered that matter, what seems to be just a solid matter, is actually really not solid. You have things like uranium that people had been using to, tint glass yellow, and that was its only use. They discovered that through a series of experiments that maybe we can talk about in the future, but they discovered that this stuff is actually very, very energetic and it's emitting massive amounts of radiation. But it took a while to figure out how to detect that. And there was a big breakthrough called the electromagnetic revolution of radiations at the turn of the century. So you had things like X-rays, ultraviolet gamma rays, a whole spectrum of electromagnetism was discovered to exist that we didn't know about before. And it had a lot to do with the fact that we discovered that the nature of matter is much more complex and energetic. It's not fixed. There's not like fixed atoms as such. And it took a while for people to figure out that we could actually start utilizing these processes in a controlled way for the benefit of human life. It took another few generations. It maybe would have happened sooner if you maybe didn't have a World War I in between, where a lot of the greatest scientists who were making those discoveries got killed. Which is, again, if you look at the real history that we're not told in school, that was another British Empire manipulation. The idea of fission is you have a heavy element like uranium, thorium, and it's giving off certain decays of beta or alpha decays that is making it lose mass very slowly. But it's a lot of energy. And if you harness that, you can do what we do today with nuclear power plants, which is, you boil water, you apply the heat that's emitted from the boiled water to spin a turbine, which makes electricity, and then you could use to get reliable, dense forms of energy for your needs as society. Now, that's not as useful as fusion, because we also discovered fusion, but we only used it. Fusion is basically the fusing together of light elements like deuterium and tritium, or helium-3 and deuterium. So you take light elements, and you can create a condition where you get a super hot plasma, and in the state of the plasma, what happens when you get those temperatures, they begin to fuse. We don't fully know the reasons why. We know things like the sun and stars seem to do that, and that's where we get the creation of the periodic table of elements. But they fuse, but when they fuse, the mass of what they were after the fusing is a little bit less than what they were separately, because part of that became energy. But that transfer of matter to energy is much more dense than it was with the case of the fission losing the beta decay. And if you apply something like that to actions that sustain human life, you could feasibly, your imagination can't even conceive of what good we could do. I mean, the amount of desalination you could accomplish very easily to green the deserts of Africa with that type of technology is very, very, very accessible. Or, as John F. Kennedy was looking at with the nuclear rocket, there was a program driving NASA based upon taking the lunar landing as a platform for industrialization and then launch into Mars, because the gravitational field is much weaker by 1/6 on the moon. So if you have a system to deploy rockets from the moon, then you're going to save a lot of energy. It's going to be much more efficient. But you can't get to Mars with chemical rockets the way you could to the moon, because it's too slow, and your bones would, your muscles would just be melted by the time you spend that much time in space. So they knew back then that they needed nuclear rockets, which is why there was an advanced nuclear rocket program, which was, again, sabotaged in 1972 when the post-industrial model came in, and all of these NASA scientists were either fired, the programs were shut down to save money, and the vision was lost.
Why?
Well, why was John F. Kennedy resisting the Malthusian takeover of the United States? Right? Why was Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy and Malcolm X all working to defend the idea that human beings are made in the image of a creator, which...
Can we put Martin Luther King in there.
Yeah.
We know what he was doing.
Oh, everybody has problems, but the point is the reason why he died was because he actually fought against some very heavy, evil bastards.
No, yes.
And he did it for a principle which they were afraid of. There was something he was unleashing that would have that the oligarchy knew was going to destroy their ability to control the society that they desired to maintain. And when you look at, we could again go on into a lot of detail here, but we don't have to do that now. We can say that for later.